Hi everyone, it's William here. I believe this is episode 8 of my YouTube series Death in Literature. So the last video we did a rather obscure book by Jean Cocteau called Les Enfants Terribles, so the terrible children, and that's an apt description, although the children, who are actually teenagers and then young adults, have their reasons for being terrible. So some very interesting deaths in that book, and I recommend it. As always, well, I don't always do it, but I always should start out by saying that this is a series full of spoilers. They are everywhere because I'm dealing with these books from a thematic perspective. And so that being the case, you have to sort of take in the whole book. And a lot of times, of course, a death is a culminating scene. So I can't really talk about it without that automatically being a spoiler. In this case, a death is, yes, truly the climactic scene, and a rather shocking one. I'm talking about The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, written in 1898, so a very late 19th century work. And poor little Miles, one of literature's true victims, in my opinion. He's the child who dies. If you haven't read the book, but don't mind the spoilers. And yeah, there are different opinions about what happens to poor Miles, but his governess has quite a direct hand in it. So we talked about Jane Eyre, where a governess, in a sense, brings death into the household. She brings things to a head so that the estranged and insane wife of her employer ultimately ends up dead. But it's likely that that would have happened anyway, because the mad woman, as she's presented to us, is definitely homicidal, and she keeps trying to set the house on fire, and she finally succeeds. So the governess can't really be blamed for that, although she's a bit of throwing a bit of fuel on the fire, because her employer is in love with her and wants to marry her. Anyway, yes, and the point of connection between The Turn of the Screw and Les Enfants Terribles is that we have two possibly terrible children, possibly under the influence of great evil, but that's debatable. And I think Henry James meant it to be debatable, and it's a debate that still is ongoing. Lots of people, myself included, love this book. It's a novella. It's short. I just now, yesterday and the day before, read it in 2 days. Okay, I would say that the governess, we don't know her name, in the 1961 movie version, she's called Miss Giddens. I think they had to come up with a name simply because, you know, in the movie, you can't have the children and the housekeeper just calling her the governess. Anyway, I would say she's one of the least likable protagonists in literature. I think I mentioned the other day, well, maybe in my Grand Duke Dmitri videos, I'm writing a novel, and in that novel I have a protagonist who in some ways is very unsympathetic, but in other ways is quite sympathetic. And I'm hoping that will work, because it's hard to make it all the way through a book, and this will be a long one, where you don't like the protagonist. And in the case of the governess, I really, really dislike her. And we'll go into that. As I said, Miles's death is highly suspicious. If this was a true story, and if I was somehow involved in it, I would absolutely demand an autopsy, because getting my head ahead of myself a little bit, but 10-year-olds usually don't drop dead, just drop dead, you know, from heart attacks or what have you. That just isn't something that happens with a apparently very healthy child. Okay, so as usual, as in Les Enfants Terribles and as in Jane Eyre, we have orphans. Yeah, you just can't get away from orphans, whether it's in mythology or folk tales or literature. You just can't. Orphans are, they have some kind of, I'll have to think about that before I comment. What it is about orphans that makes it so necessary for so many characters to be orphans. Sometimes it's obvious, other times not. And a lot of times in mythology, orphans are heroes. They're heroic. They overcome great obstacles. Other times not, anyway. So there one possible way of understanding this book, and the way the governess sees this, is the children are possessed. They're maybe they don't have the spirits necessarily inside their bodies, but they're so much under the control of the spirits that they're basically channeling them. And so what is it about children and ghost stories and possession stories? You know, what is it about that? So many of them have a child who is particularly sensitive to spiritual things. And that's a topos that you see over and over again in films in particular. So you have the little girl in the first Poltergeist movie. You have a little boy in A Stir of Echoes, which is a very good ghost movie. You have the little boy in The Sixth Sense. You have a little boy in The Ring who's very sensitive to spiritual things. In The Exorcist, you have a girl who's possessed. And in my opinion, what that movie is really about, actually, is about the fear of female sexuality, how scary it can be for some reason. And she's an adolescent, and when she's possessed, she expresses herself in very, very sexual ways, really disturbingly so. And what's scary about that movie is not the idea of possession. It's the idea that people are so terrified of female sexuality. I would say in The Witch, again, you have a girl, an adolescent girl, like in The Exorcist, and she has a brother who's sort of more spiritually sensitive than she is. And so these are just some examples of how children are absolutely rife in stories about the supernatural, whether ghost stories or stories about possession. So one of the big questions in The Turn of the Screw is, are there actual ghosts? So the governess sees ghosts, but the other members of the household do not. The governess is absolutely convinced that the children do see the ghost, but the children deny it. And I don't know that I get the impression from the narrative from Henry James that the children do see ghosts. Anyway, we'll come to that. So just to sort of recap the whole story, a young woman comes to a remote country estate to be the governess to a little girl, primarily. The guardian, an uncle of these orphan children, does not want anything to do with them. He doesn't want to be bothered. He doesn't want her to contact him in any way. The children are just completely in her care. And within a very short time, the brother, the little girl is 8 and the boy is 10, he's expelled from school. And a letter comes saying that he's been expelled from school, but it doesn't say why. And at that point, the governess is really left with a choice to make. Does she contact the school? Does she contact the uncle? Does she at least ask the child, why were you expelled from school? And in my opinion, she makes the wrong choice. She decides not to, and for a very suspicious reason. She considers these children to be just absolutely so beautiful that it's a kind of supernatural beauty. You know, the word angelic and even the word divine is used. So the little girl is angelic, but the 10-year-old boy is divine. She responds to him as like a god of love, like, you know, the embodiment of Eros. And that's problematic because he is 10 and he may be a very good-looking boy. But, you know, she's putting this on him, something that he's just at 10. You can't, how can you shoulder somebody's projection of the divine child? and specifically the divine child who's a God of love. And so that's unfair to begin with. And she's also just completely charmed by them. They're both precocious, and they're both very kind and polite, and she just is in awe of these children. They're radiant to her, but we all know that radiance casts a shadow. Sunlight casts a shadow. If these children are little sort of solar deities, that casts a shadow. And so what is the shadow side? Maybe not the literal shadow side, but the shadow side that she perceives. So, and the tension starts to build. And she herself, she's the narrator, so the idea of the novel is that this governess has written in her later years an account of these extraordinary events. And she refers to that hush in which something gathers or crouches and then springs like a beast. So the tension is building. She's got an illiterate housekeeper who's the only other person that she communicates with aside from the children. And the poor housekeeper just doesn't know what to do. She's a woman of common sense, but she's got this educated lady telling her that there are ghosts and that the children are in mortal danger, so she just doesn't know what to do. So who are the ghosts? The ghosts are the former governess, Miss Jessel, and a valet or valet named Peter Quint. And when he was first saddled with the children, the uncle decided to put Peter Quint in charge of everything. Even though Peter Quint had just been his manservant, he sent Peter Quint down to the country to take care of the children and put him in charge of everything. And Miss Jessel fell for him in a big way. And they both ended up dead. So Miss Jessel apparently killed herself. It's not 100% clear. And Peter Quint, he slipped on ice and fell and died of head trauma. He was a little suspicious to begin with because he's a redhead. And one of the superstitions, unfortunately, I actually used to be a redhead myself when I was a baby, but then as I got older, my hair actually changed, is that in superstition, in folk traditions and superstition, redheadedness is very often a red flag. It means there's some kind of association with the devil. And believe me, I'm not saying that's the actual case. I was not a devil child back when I had red hair. But yeah, it's apparent to me from a modern perspective. So these are vicious people, both Miss Jessel and Peter Quint. The uncle didn't know about it, but the governess, Mrs. Gross, not the governess, the housekeeper, Mrs. Gross, saw firsthand that these were really vicious people. They were depraved. We don't get the details, but clearly it's some kind of sexual depravity. And she just doesn't feel like she can say anything. She's illiterate. She's, basically a peasant woman, and she just takes care of the house. And she is a genuinely sympathetic character. Yes, she should have stepped in, but the poor woman just didn't know what to do. And the inference that I draw from it is that the children, instead of being possessed by the ghosts of Peter Quint and Miss Jessel, whom the governess sees and they claim not to see and Mrs. Gross doesn't see, instead of being possessed, the secret that they have is that they've been sexually abused by these servants. And that really fits in with everything that's going on in this novel. And anyway, so I wanted to talk about the fact that The Turn of the Screw, of course, was written by a man, Henry James, but it's from the viewpoint of a woman. And you could say, well, it's typical of a male writer. She's just the type of the hysterical woman. But I actually wonder, I wonder if there isn't some unconscious element, I don't know. I haven't really developed my thoughts about when an author writes a protagonist who's of the opposite gender. When a man writes for a woman protagonist, when a woman writes for a man protagonist, or a boy or a girl. And I know that my friend Judy would absolutely say from the get-go, she is not, she doesn't think like a woman. And the reason Judy would say that, whether she's right or wrong, is that she has some very masculine traits. She is obsessed with the idea of triumphing over the ghosts, which means over the children. They have the secret that they're keeping from her, and she, by God, is going to get it out of them. And it becomes, these are the words she uses: triumph and heroism. She wants to be a hero, and the need to take possession, just really take possession of these children, and win. And Judy, at least I know, would say, well, yeah, there are plenty of women who want to succeed at whatever they do, but they're not. But this is a masculine way of framing it, this triumph and taking possession and that sort of thing. So I wonder if that was something unconscious on the part of Henry James. And actually, the breaking point between the governess and Miles is when they're walking to church, and Miles starts a conversation with her, and he tells her, look, when am I going to go back to school? Any school. I like you very much. You're a charming person. I like spending time with you, but I want to be around other boys. I want to be in a more masculine environment. And she is just so upset by that. It's really strange. She's so upset by it that she sends Miles into church, and then she turns around herself and goes and walks back to the manor house without saying a word to the children or to the housekeeper, Mrs. Gross, who's with them in the church. She goes back, and she's going to pack her bag and leave. And then, she sees one of the ghosts, and she decides not to. She decides that she has to beat the ghosts and win. But why did this upset her so much? And was it because this boy was telling her basically that as a female, your place is to be here, and I have, that's fine, that's great, but I want to be around other males. And is that what upsets her? I don't know. I'd love to hear what you think about it. And there's this so is there enough sort of rage that she would never acknowledge that comes for her out of this, that she literally ends up killing Miles? Yeah, I don't know, but it's an interesting thought, I think. Now, many of the readers and the commenters and the filmmakers who made the excellent 1961 film have seen this mainly as coming from repressed sexuality on her part. And she certainly has just fallen head over heels for little Miles, which is creepy. And Miles understands that it's creepy. Now, he has been presented, especially in the 1961 movie, as the seductive child. The child who's trying to seduce her. And in one of the film scenes in the movies that you don't have in the book, I don't think, he kisses her right on the lips. But, I don't know. Okay, if he's been sexually abused by his former caregivers, maybe he thinks that that's how you're supposed to relate to people to get their affection. But on the other hand, I didn't really see an actual seductiveness of him in the novella as opposed to the movie. And there definitely is some repressed sexuality on her part, but I don't know that it's necessarily the essential thing, except that she is very, very attracted to Miles. So the governess wants both children to admit that they are in some kind of intense contact with the two ghosts. And there's objectively established that when the children are upset, they just spew obscenities. So Mrs. Gross observes that in the little girl, and of course it's understood that they got this from their former caregivers, and that the reason Miles was expelled from school was because of things he was saying to the other boys, along the lines of what the little girl says to Flora, says to the housekeeper, that's just obscene. So, the governess takes this to mean that they are pretty much possessed or so close with these ghosts, and she has the idea, you don't get them, I get them. And she so upsets the little girl by insisting that the little girl is lying and seeing the ghost of Miss Jessel that the little girl just finally freaks out and just doesn't want to see her, and is so upset that Mrs. Gross says that little Flora is asking her every 3 minutes, is the governess coming, is the governess coming? And that sounds to me another indication that the children might have been sexually abused, and that, she's saying she's worried about the governess coming because the previous governess was abusing her. And why else would she freak out over something like this? And it's so bad that she has to be sent away. Mrs. Gross takes the little girl off to London, and they're going to go to the uncle. Meanwhile, the governess has arranged that there will be no servants at the house, that it will be completely just her and Miles, and there's going to be this showdown between the two of them. And, she is going to wrest from Miles, no matter what, an admission that he does see and is in league with Peter Quint. And she describes shaking him. It's not clear, even so, what she could have done that would actually kill him, except maybe scare him to death, if that's a real thing. But she sort of drives him into a frenzy. And he finally gives her what she wants, and yells out the name of Peter Quint. And then he drops dead. And she goes to, pick him up and cuddle him. And then it's like, oh, whoops, he's dead, And so I think in the book, I think there's a line at the end about when she's describing well, maybe I went a little too far. He's like, yeah, you think? Maybe? The child's dead. And I guess the uncle really was indifferent, because we find out later that she became a governess again in another household where she was much beloved. And so there were no consequences of this for her. And I'm actually a little indignant about that, even though it's completely fictional. I mean, yeah, what is going on? So it is a very memorable death, because it's so shocking and it's so tragic. And I remember the first time I read this, it's like, you've got to be kidding me. Even if he's so scared, for one thing, why, unless he has some hidden heart condition, why would a 10-year-old just drop dead? So it seems a little implausible, unless she actually strangled him or something. But then, of course, there would have been an inquest. All right, so I've gotten far too into this. Now I want to, have my own inquest on what happened to Miles. I guess I kind of relate to him, although I was never a beautiful, divine, or an evil child. So, so there are two film versions. The 1961 film version emphasizes the psychological aspect of the governess sort of slowly going mad. And you find this sometimes in supernatural books and movies, where there's this really thin line between madness and between that and responding to actual supernatural evil. The Shining would be an example of that. The Kubrick book, not really the Kubrick film, not really the Stephen King book. But the 1961 version with Deborah Kerr is really good, and the boy who plays Miles is just stupendous. The later version that came out in the early 2000s, I think, horrible. I was so excited to see that movie, and then it was just rotten. So that's about it. Not sure what we're going to do next time. Maybe The Lord of the Flies, maybe Dracula. Both of them would make sense, I guess, because The Lord of the Flies with the children and the question of evil. And Dracula, on the other hand, with the supernatural and repressed sexuality. Both of them have some pretty shocking and gripping deaths. So, yeah, I hope to see you then. Bye.